My parents sat me down at the kitchen table like they were delivering some kind of family decree. Your sister owes $5,000, my father said, and you're the responsible one. You'll pay it off. They didn't ask, they demanded, as if my paycheck, my savings, my future belonged to them by default. For years, I swallowed their guilt trips, their lectures about family duty. But this time was different. I wasn't going to bleed for mistakes that weren't mine. And when I finally pushed back, I didn't just refuse, I forced them to put it in writing. Money had always been the invisible weight in our family. It wasn't that we were broke. We weren't. My parents both worked steady jobs, and our bills were paid. But the way they handled money was toxic. Every dollar that passed through their hands became a tool for control. If I needed new shoes, I'd hear about how expensive kids were. If I wanted to go on a school trip, it was, maybe if you appreciated what we already do for you. Meanwhile, my sister, Rachel, lived under a completely different set of rules. She was the baby, the golden child, the one my parents bent over backwards to protect. If she wanted a new phone, she got it. If she racked up credit card debt, Dad would cover it and call it a lesson learned. I grew up watching her mistakes get erased, while mine became permanent stains on my character. By the time we were adults, nothing had changed. I had worked my way into a steady job, nothing glamorous, but enough to pay rent, cover groceries, and save a little. Rachel, on the other hand, was still bouncing between short-lived jobs, always figuring things out, always one step away from disaster. My parents enabled it at every turn. So when they called me over one evening and sat me down at the kitchen table, I should have known what was coming. My father leaned forward, his voice carrying that fake gravity he used when he thought he was being wise. Your sister's in trouble. She owes $5,000. And as the responsible one, you're going to help. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even framed as an option. My mother chimed in, her tone dripping with guilt. Family sticks together. You know Rachel would do the same for you. That last line nearly made me laugh out loud. Rachel wouldn't lift a finger for me if my life depended on it. She'd once borrowed money from me for a car payment and conveniently forgotten to ever pay it back. And here they were, telling me to bail her out again, this time with thousands of dollars. Something inside me snapped that night. For years, I played the role they wrote for me. The dutiful son, the one who sacrifices, the one who never says no. But sitting at that table, staring at their expectant faces, I realized they weren't asking me to save Rachel. They were testing how far they could push me, how much more I'd be willing to give up before I finally broke. And for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. I wasn't going to hand over $5,000 to cover for my sister's recklessness. If my parents wanted to drag me into this mess, then they were going to face a version of me they hadn't seen before. A version who demanded accountability. And that was the moment I decided. If they wanted to treat me like a bank, then I'd make them sign the paperwork. The next few days after that kitchen table ambush were unbearable. My parents acted as if the decision had already been made, like I'd agreed without a word. Every phone call, every text message was another layer of pressure. Have you set up the transfer yet? My mom would ask casually, as though we were talking about picking up groceries. My dad sent me a spreadsheet one morning. Yes, a literal spreadsheet, laying out options for how I could pull together the $5,000. He had mapped out my savings, my monthly expenses, even suggested cutting back on food and luxuries, like Netflix, to make it work faster. It was surreal. I wasn't being treated like their son. I was being treated like their employee, or worse, their personal ATM. Rachel, of course, didn't say a word. She never called, never texted, never apologized. The only time I saw her, she was posting photos on Instagram from a weekend trip with her friends. Smiling, drinking, shopping, like she didn't have a single care in the world. My parents ignored it. When I brought it up, my mom said, "She's just trying to stay positive. Stress isn't good for her right now." Stress wasn't good for her? What about me? I was the one being told to empty my account for her mistakes. At work, I couldn't focus. Every time my phone buzzed, it was another guilt trip. Think about family loyalty. Rachel would do it for you. Don't you want to see your sister get back on her feet? The lies were so obvious it was insulting. Rachel wouldn't do it for me, and they knew it. But they repeated the script anyway, like if they said it enough, I'd start believing it. Emily, my girlfriend, was the one who finally snapped me out of it. One night, after another tense dinner at my parents' house, I came home and sat in silence, my head in my hands. She poured me a glass of water, sat across from me, and asked the question I'd been avoiding. Why are you even considering this? I didn't answer right away. Part of me didn't want to admit the truth, because that's what I'd always done. I'd always carried the weight, always given in. It was the path of least resistance. But Emily wasn't letting me off the hook. This isn't about money. It's about control. They know you'll cave if they push hard enough. You can't keep living like this. Her words hit me like a jolt. She was right. $5,000 wasn't the real issue. It was the symbol of every time I'd bent, every time I'd let them treat me like I didn't matter. That was the night I decided enough was enough. I wasn't going to scream or fight or beg. I was going to turn their own language against them, the language of money, contracts, and obligations. If they wanted me to pay, they were going to acknowledge, in writing, what they had demanded. And once it was written down, they'd never be able to twist the story again. The next weekend, my parents invited me over for family dinner. The invitation sounded innocent, but I knew better. Family dinners were rarely about food. They were about control. And sure enough, the moment I walked through the door, I saw Rachel sitting at the table, arms crossed, expression smug. It was clear they had staged this. My mom greeted me with a forced smile. We thought it would be good if you and your sister could talk this through. We're all family here, after all. Rachel barely looked up from her phone. Yeah, she muttered. It's not even that much money. You make decent money, don't you? $5,000 isn't going to kill you. The audacity nearly knocked me back. My jaw clenched as I tried to keep my cool. It's not about the amount, I said. It's about responsibility. Why is it automatically my problem? My dad leaned forward, his voice carrying that same rehearsed authority I'd heard my whole life. Because you're the stable one. We can't trust Rachel with money right now, and she needs help. That's what families do. I laughed bitterly. Families don't dump their screw-ups on one person and call it loyalty. Rachel rolled her eyes. Oh, please. You're being dramatic. It's not like I haven't helped you before. That was too much. Helped me? When? The time you borrowed money and never paid it back? The time you left me stranded because you took my car without asking and ran it out of gas? Her face flushed red, but she stayed silent. My parents quickly jumped in to shield her. My mom's voice went soft, almost pleading. She's your sister. She's young. She makes mistakes. But she has a good heart. If you don't step up now, this could ruin her future. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. You mean if I don't step up, she'll have to face the consequences of her own choices, like the rest of us do? My dad slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. Enough. You will help her. Do you understand me? I won't have this family torn apart because you're being selfish. Selfish. The word stung, but it also clarified everything. In their eyes, my refusal to be used was selfish. My insistence on fairness was selfish. My demand to be treated like more than a wallet was selfish. I took a deep breath and looked each of them in the eye. If you want me to pay, then you're going to put it in writing. A promissory note, signed by both of you, acknowledging that you're asking me to take responsibility for Rachel's debt. No more pretending this is voluntary. No more rewriting the story later. If you want the money, you're going to own the demand. The room went silent. Rachel's jaw dropped. My parents exchanged a look, stunned by the shift. For once, I wasn't the one on the defensive. The silence after my words was heavy. My mother blinked at me like I had spoken another language. My father leaned back in his chair, his face darkening. Rachel snorted. A promissory note? What are you, a banker now? I didn't flinch. If you want my money, then yes. That's exactly what I am. My dad shook his head slowly, as if I had disappointed him in some profound way. You're missing the point. This isn't business. This is family. Families don't write contracts. Families trust each other. I laughed bitterly. Exactly. And you've proven I can't trust you. You've erased every debt Rachel's ever had and called it a fresh start. If I give her this money without proof, you'll rewrite history in 6 months and say I was happy to help. No, not this time. Rachel leaned forward, her tone mocking. Wow, all this over $5,000? You're acting like it's life or death. I locked eyes with her. It's not about the money. It's about accountability. Something you've never had to face. My mother's voice softened, the way it always did when she tried to manipulate me. Honey, think of it this way. You're not giving Rachel money. You're loaning it. When she's back on her feet, she'll pay you back. We'll make sure of it. There it was, the twist. They wanted to turn this into a family loan, a vague promise with no teeth. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Then sign the note. If it's really a loan, if you really mean what you're saying, put your names on paper. For the first time, my father hesitated. His eyes darted to my mother, then to Rachel. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Finally, he said, "We don't need paperwork. Our words should be enough." I smiled thinly. Your words stopped being enough a long time ago. The room grew tense again. Rachel rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath, "This is ridiculous." I turned to her. "No, what's ridiculous is you running up debt you can't pay and expecting me to clean it up. What's ridiculous is our parents backing you every single time while they call me the selfish one. This note isn't just about $5,000. It's about proving I'm not crazy when I say you've been carried your whole life." My father's jaw tightened. "You think this makes you strong? All it does is drive a wedge deeper into this family." I met his stare without blinking. "No, Dad. The wedge has been there for years. I'm just finally refusing to ignore it." My mother looked like she was about to cry again, her eyes darting around the table, searching for an opening. But there wasn't one. Not this time. For the first time in my life, I had shifted the balance, and they didn't know how to handle it. The following week, I learned just how far my parents were willing to go. It started with a phone call from my aunt. She rarely reached out to me directly, so I knew immediately that something was off. "I heard you're refusing to help your sister," she said without even saying hello. Her voice carried the edge of rehearsed indignation, the kind you hear when someone's been fed a one-sided story. I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Let me guess. Mom and Dad told you I'm abandoning the family." She hesitated just long enough to confirm I was right. "They said Rachel's in serious trouble, and you're making it worse by demanding paperwork? What is that about?" I almost laughed. Of course they had twisted it. Of course they had painted me as the cold, ungrateful son who cared more about signatures than his sister's well-being. By Sunday dinner, the trap was fully set. When I walked into the dining room, I saw not just my parents and Rachel, but also my aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins. A full audience. My mom greeted me with a brittle smile, her voice pitched just a little too loud. "We thought it would be good to have everyone here," she said, "so they can understand what's happening." Translation: so they can pressure you into compliance. Sure enough, before I could even sit down, my uncle started in. $5,000 isn't the end of the world. Why are you making such a big deal about this? She's your sister." Rachel smirked, clearly enjoying the show. "Exactly. He acts like I've committed a crime." I sat down slowly, deliberately, letting the silence build before I spoke. "You want to know why I'm making this a big deal? Because it's not just $5,000. It's every favor that was never repaid. It's every time I was told to be responsible while Rachel was handed a free pass. And now they want me to sign away my savings like I owe it to her. I don't." My aunt frowned. "But demanding a promissory note? From your own parents? That's extreme." I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "What's extreme is being treated like a walking wallet while my sister posts vacation selfies. What's extreme is being gaslit into thinking I'm selfish for refusing to bankroll her mistakes. If my parents really mean what they say, that this is just a loan, then signing a piece of paper shouldn't scare them." The room went quiet. My father's face tightened, his eyes darting nervously to the folder I had brought with me. My mother wrung her hands, clearly unsettled by the fact that their plan wasn't working. Daniel, my brother, spoke up for the first time. He had been quiet until now, but his voice cut through the tension. "He's right. If you're asking him to shoulder this, he deserves proof. Otherwise, it's just another one of Rachel's messes being brushed under the rug." Rachel's face twisted in anger. "You're taking his side?" Daniel shrugged. "I'm taking the side of common sense." For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across the faces of the relatives my parents had recruited. The narrative was slipping, and I intended to keep pulling that thread until the whole thing unraveled. I had come prepared. While my parents thought they could corner me with an audience, I'd brought my own ammunition, receipts. Literal, physical receipts. As the tension thickened, I slid a small envelope onto the table. "Since everyone's here," I said, my tone calm but cutting, "let's take a look at what this so-called financial crisis really looks like." My father stiffened. "Don't start this." But I ignored him. I pulled out printouts of Rachel's public Instagram posts, shopping bags from designer stores, photos of brunches at upscale restaurants, hotel check-ins from weekends away. I placed them one by one on the table, each image punctuated by the silence of everyone watching. "This," I said, pointing to a photo of Rachel holding cocktails. Was the same weekend she asked me for gas money. This trip to Miami. I tapped another printout. That was 2 weeks before the credit card debt she claims is destroying her life. And these shopping bags? Bought 3 days after she told you all she was barely scraping by. Rachel's face went crimson. You've been stalking me? I leaned back, folding my arms. No. I've been watching you broadcast your life, while our parents expect me to clean up the mess behind it. That's not stalking, it's evidence. My aunt shifted uncomfortably. My uncle cleared his throat, but said nothing. The cousins stared at the table, clearly embarrassed to have been dragged into this. Emily, who had been sitting quietly beside me, finally spoke. You don't get to call him selfish for asking questions. You should be asking Rachel why she thinks she's entitled to live this way while someone else pays her bills. Rachel opened her mouth to fire back, but Daniel beat her to it. His voice was low, steady, and deadly serious. I've known about some of this for a while. She doesn't care. She just assumes mom and dad, or now you, will cover it. Honestly, I'm glad it's finally out in the open. The silence that followed was different this time. Thicker, heavier. My parents' plan to shame me had backfired spectacularly. Their audience had turned into witnesses against them. My mother finally snapped, her voice trembling. Why are you doing this to us? To her? She's family. I met her eyes. Exactly. And family means responsibility. Not just mine, hers too. If Rachel won't take responsibility, then the least you can do is stop rewriting the story and admit what's happening. If you still want me involved, you're signing the promissory note. Tonight. No excuses, no delays. The table was quiet except for Rachel's sharp breathing, her face twisted in rage. My father looked like he wanted to erupt, but he didn't. He knew the evidence was stacked too high. I leaned forward, resting my hand on the folder. The choice is simple. Sign or I walk. And when I walk, I don't come back. The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade, and for the first time, I could see it in their eyes. They knew I wasn't bluffing. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves were waiting for someone to speak. Finally, my father broke. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice low and gravelly. All right, he said, maybe we handled this wrong. Maybe Rachel shouldn't have spent like that. But $5,000 isn't the end of the world. You don't need to turn this into some legal battle. His tone was calmer, almost measured, negotiator mode. I'd seen it before when he wanted to downplay something serious. You're right, I said. It's not the end of the world, but it's the end of me being your doormat. He frowned, his forehead creasing. Don't exaggerate. We've all helped each other in this family. That's how it works. I paid for your car when you were younger, didn't I? I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. No, you co-signed the loan, then guilt me into paying it off early so it wouldn't hit your credit. That wasn't generosity. That was self-preservation. Daniel smirked, shaking his head. He's not wrong, Dad. I remember that. My father's jaw tightened. He turned to Emily, as if hoping for backup. Surely you see how extreme this is? A promissory note? For family. Emily didn't flinch. I see a man who's been used for years finally asking for accountability. If that feels extreme to you, maybe the problem isn't him. The room fell into another uneasy silence. My mother reached for her wine glass, her hand shaking slightly. Rachel sat stiffly, her arms crossed, glaring at me like a child denied candy. My father sighed heavily, running a hand down his face. All right, suppose we sign this paper of yours. What then? You're going to drag us into court if we miss a payment? Is that what you want, for your parents to be dragged through mud in public? I met his gaze, steady and unblinking. If it comes to that, yes. Because I'm done letting you rewrite the story. You've called me selfish, ungrateful, too hard on Rachel. But the truth is, I've been the only one holding this family up, and I won't do it silently anymore. My aunt cleared her throat softly. Honestly, I don't see what's so wrong with him wanting it in writing. If it's really just a loan, then signing should be easy. The look on my father's face at that moment was priceless, caught between fury and resignation. For years, he had been the one manipulating the narrative. Now, in front of witnesses, even his own relatives weren't buying it. He finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Fine. You want a note? You'll get your note. But the way he said it wasn't surrender. It was a warning. A promise that this wasn't over, that agreeing now was just another move in a longer game. And I knew then, getting the signature would be a victory, but it wouldn't be the end. It would just peel back another layer of secrets they'd tried to keep buried. The next evening, my father called me over under the guise of sorting things out. His voice on the phone was calm, almost too calm. I knew that tone. It was the one he used when he thought he had regained the upper hand. When I arrived, he already had papers spread out on the dining table. Not the promissory note I had asked for, but a document he had clearly drafted himself. The heading read, Family Loan Agreement. I scanned the first page, and my blood boiled. It was written in vague, slippery language. Support provided voluntarily, repayment subject to ability, amount to be negotiated at a later date. In other words, it was worthless. This isn't a promissory note, I said flatly. My father leaned back, steepling his fingers. It's better. This way it's flexible. We acknowledge your contribution without making it hostile. I dropped the paper on the table. Hostile? Hostile is demanding I bail out Rachel like it's my duty. Hostile is turning the whole family against me because I won't cave. This paper is just another way for you to rewrite the story. Rachel was there too, lounging on the couch with her phone. She piped up without looking at me. God, you're so dramatic. Just sign it and move on. It's not like you're going to miss the money. I turned on her, my voice sharper than I intended. This is exactly why you'll never change. Because every time you screw up, they bend reality to protect you. And then I'm the one expected to clean up. My father's face tightened. Watch your tone. This is still my house. I leaned in, my voice low but unwavering. And this is still my money. If you want it, it's going to be on my terms. A real promissory note. Signed, with dates, with amounts, and with consequences if you fail. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Rachel tapping furiously on her phone. Finally, my mother broke the silence, her voice brittle. Why are you doing this to us? Can't you see you're tearing this family apart? I snapped my head toward her. No. You tore this family apart the moment you decided my role was to pay for Rachel's mistakes. I'm just refusing to play along anymore. I pulled a blank promissory note template from my bag. I had printed it earlier, anticipating this stunt, and slid it across the table. This is what I'll sign. Nothing else. No vague language. No loopholes. $5,000. Repayment schedule. Interest if it's late. If you want me involved, this is the only way. My father stared at the paper, his jaw twitching. For the first time, I saw something crack in his expression, not just anger, but fear. And that's when I realized, this wasn't just about $5,000. There was something else my parents were desperate to keep hidden. My father stared at the template I'd slid across the table like it was a weapon. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening against the edge of the chair. My mother shifted uneasily beside him, glancing from his face to mine, as if she knew what was coming but prayed he'd keep it buried. Finally, he muttered, You don't understand what you're asking. I raised an eyebrow. I'm asking for accountability. For the first time in my life, I want something in writing instead of empty promises. He slammed his hand on the table, making my mother flinch. You think this is just about Rachel? You think it's as simple as a spoiled kid spending? If I sign this, it opens doors you don't want opened. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. I leaned forward. Then explain. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks exactly like Rachel's mess and your refusal to let her face it. Rachel finally looked up from her phone, her face pale. Dad? She started, but he silenced her with a sharp glance. That glance told me everything. Rachel knew more than she'd admitted. Emily, sitting beside me, spoke softly but firmly. What doors exactly? Because it sounds like you're not protecting Rachel. You're protecting yourselves. My father's eyes snapped to her, and for the first time, I saw a genuine panic flicker there. Not anger, not manipulation, fear. You don't know the half of it, he said, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. The debt isn't just hers. Some of it's ours. We consolidated things, moved accounts around. If you force this on a paper, you're not just holding her accountable. You're exposing us. The room fell silent. My mother finally broke down, her eyes brimming with tears. We thought we could manage it. We didn't want you to know. You've always been so proud of being independent. We couldn't let you see how much trouble we were in. I stared at them, the realization hitting me like ice water. This wasn't about Rachel's recklessness alone. My parents had been drowning in debt and using her as the scapegoat. They tried to pin it on me, guilt me into covering it, while pretending it was only about helping my sister. My chest tightened, anger rising. So let me get this straight. You demanded I pay off $5,000. painted Rachel as the irresponsible one. And the whole time it was your debt? You used her as cover. Neither of them spoke. Their silence was louder than any confession. I felt Emily squeeze my hand, grounding me as my thoughts raced. For years, I had believed I was the selfish one. For years, they'd convinced me my role was to sacrifice, to clean up, to be the responsible one. But now the mask was off. I stood, gathering the papers into my hand. If you won't sign, then fine. But understand this, I'm done playing along. The next time you come after me for money, I won't just demand a note. I'll take everything to court. The fear on my father's face told me I'd finally hit the nerve he never wanted exposed. The fallout came quicker than I expected. I thought my parents would try to bury the truth, patch it up quietly, and pretend nothing had happened. But the cracks were already too wide, and the people they'd invited into this mess weren't going to stay silent. Daniel was the first to act. He called me the next day. I told Aunt Lisa everything, he admitted. They wanted to make you look like the selfish one, but I couldn't let them keep spinning it. She knows the debt wasn't just Rachel's anymore. By the end of the week, the whispers had spread through the family. My uncle cornered me at the grocery store, shaking his head. They said you were refusing to help your sister. Now I hear they were hiding their own debt. What the hell is going on? I shrugged. Exactly what it looks like. Years of manipulation finally catching up to them. The truth hit my parents like a wrecking ball. For years, they had crafted the image of being responsible, respectable, the couple who sacrificed for their kids, who always had everything under control. But once the narrative unraveled, so did their reputation. At Sunday dinner the following week, the atmosphere was completely different. The extended family was there again, but this time, the silence wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at my parents. My mother fidgeted nervously with her napkin. My father tried to speak with authority, but his voice cracked more than once. Aunt Lisa finally said what everyone else was thinking. You demanded money from your son while hiding your own debt. You let Rachel take the fall for you. Do you realize how that looks? Rachel looked ready to sink into her chair. For once, she wasn't the center of their protection. She was part of the wreckage. My father's face reddened. We did what we had to do. You don't understand the pressure we've been under. Daniel leaned forward, his tone icy. We understand perfectly. You've been living beyond your means for years and using him as your safety net. That's not pressure. That's selfishness. My mother's eyes darted toward me, pleading. Please, don't let this destroy the family. We can still fix it. I held her gaze, calm and unflinching. The only way to fix this is accountability. Real accountability. Either you take responsibility and make this right, or you live with everyone knowing the truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. My parents looked around the table, searching for support, but none came. Their carefully built image, years of posturing, guilt-tripping, and manipulation, had crumbled in a single week. For the first time, I wasn't the one carrying the shame. It was theirs to bear. And as I sat there, watching them struggle under the weight of their own lies, I realized something. This wasn't just about reclaiming $5,000. It was about reclaiming my dignity. And that was worth far more. The tension at that dinner table was unbearable, but I knew it was the perfect moment to finish what I had started. Everyone had seen through the lies. My parents' credibility was gone, their excuses stripped bare. All that remained was the choice: accountability or complete collapse. I reached into my bag and pulled out the same promissory note template I'd carried for weeks. I laid it on the table, smoothed the paper flat, and placed a pen on top. This, I said, my voice steady, is how this ends. No more guilt trips, no more vague promises. You demanded I cover Rachel's debt, and you've admitted it wasn't just hers. If you want me involved at all, you're signing this. Tonight, in front of everyone. My father bristled. You're humiliating us. I didn't blink. No, you humiliated yourselves the moment you lied to me, lied to them, and tried to use me as your bank. This is the only way forward. My mother looked around the table, searching desperately for support. None came. Even Rachel sat in silence, her face pale, her phone forgotten in her lap. Daniel finally spoke, his voice sharp. He's right. Sign it. If you really meant what you said about paying him back, prove it. Aunt Lisa nodded. It's the least you can do after dragging all of us into this. The weight of the room shifted. For once, I wasn't alone. The very people my parents had tried to recruit to shame me were now siding against them. My father's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. For years, I'd watched him sign papers with confidence. Mortgages, loans, even the bills I knew he couldn't really afford. But this time, the pen felt heavy in his grip. He looked at me with pure venom in his eyes, but there was nothing he could do. Slowly, deliberately, he signed his name. My mother followed, her handwriting shaky, the ink blotching where her hand paused too long. When the pen landed back on the table, the silence that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was final. I folded the paper neatly and slid it back into my folder. There it is. Accountability. For the first time in years. My parents sat in stunned silence, their empire of manipulation reduced to a single sheet of paper with their names on it. They had no more weapons, no more lies that could twist this back onto me. I stood, Emily rising beside me, Daniel following with a small, satisfied smile. As I walked out of the house, the air felt lighter. I wasn't just leaving dinner. I was leaving behind years of control, years of being treated like a pawn. And for the first time, I knew this truth. My worth was no longer theirs to define. They wanted to make me pay for Rachel's mistakes. Instead, they ended up signing away their illusion of power. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effect of that night didn't fade, it grew. My parents, once the pillars of respectability in our extended family, now found themselves whispered about in corners. Relatives who had always admired their discipline now saw the truth. It was all built on manipulation and borrowed time. They did try to push back. My mother called me several times, begging me to tear up the note, insisting that family business doesn't belong on paper. My father tried guilt, then anger, then silence. But none of it worked. The signature was there, in ink. And every time they looked at it, they were forced to remember that they'd lost control. Rachel never apologized, not once. She avoided me completely, which, frankly, was the best gift she could give. Without me to bankroll her, she finally had to start facing her own bills. For the first time, my parents couldn't swoop in and fix everything. Emily and I used that period to breathe, to build. We set our own goals, saving for a wedding that wouldn't depend on anyone else's approval. I realized that true freedom wasn't about money. It was about refusing to let others dictate how I used mine. The $5,000? I'll probably see it eventually, though part of me doesn't care anymore. What mattered was taking back the narrative, forcing them to admit on paper what they had tried for years to deny. That piece of paper wasn't just a promissory note. It was the end of their control over me. And walking away that night, with Emily's hand in mine and Daniel's quiet support at my back, I finally understood something. Family doesn't mean obedience. It doesn't mean sacrifice at any cost. Real family means respect. And if they couldn't give me that, then they didn't deserve the power they'd held over me for so long. So that's how it happened. My parents tried to force me into paying off my sister's $5,000 debt, convinced I'd roll over like always. Instead, I turned the tables, made them sign a promissory note, and ended years of manipulation in one night. But here's what I want to know. Backhand index pointing right: if your family demanded you pay a sibling's debt, would you agree just to keep the peace? Or would you stand your ground like I did? Backhand index pointing right: do you think I went too far by making them sign paperwork? Or was that the only way to finally break the cycle? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading them all. And if you want more stories about betrayal, family drama, and hard-won victories, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter.